Packer's 1968 claim that the Osiris figure, which is what we have as Abraham here, the Egyptians say that's Osiris, and in 1968, Richard Parker thought that the figure would have been ithyphallic, but Ed Ashmont didn't follow that. He didn't agree with that, and John Gee says he knows of no other papyrus lion couch scene with an ithyphallic figure, or any Egyptian drawing where someone wearing breeches, as seen in facsimile 1, is ithyphallic. Now, why do most anti-Mormons follow Larson instead of Ashmont? Now, some critics may be unaware of Ashmont's reconstructions, and it's possible that they follow this because it's more shocking if they're trying to diss Mormonism. There are at least 3 responses to the arguments regarding the restorations. Some scholars, such as Kevin Barney and Michael Rhodes, have noted the possibility that Joseph Smith, Reuben Hedlock, the engraver who made the facsimiles, there we go, or someone else may have filled in the lacuna in the papyri the best they could have for purposes of publication. 19th century printers didn't have the same standards that we have today. They wouldn't have wanted to publish incomplete facsimiles, so they repaired them for publication purposes, not necessarily from inspiration. It's also possible that either Joseph repaired some of the parts, which may not have been in the original, in order to more closely approximate the details or intent conveyed by the Abrahamic text in relation to the vignettes. Joseph's corrections to the later editions of the Book of Mormon, the Doctrine and Covenants, and even the Joseph Smith translation of the Bible are all instructive on this issue. In each case, Joseph, by way of revelation, inspiration, or analysis, restored or amended Scripture to more closely approximate the additional insights he had gleaned by divine revelation. Then thirdly, since the actual papyri was not written by Abraham himself, it's possible that the scribe who composed the particular sense and text altered the traditional ways of creating the funerary scene in order to convey an illustration that more closely coincided with the teachings of Abraham. It is significant to point out that the placement of the illustration of facsimile 1 within a sense and text appears to be highly unusual. According to Dr. Gee, this is the only instance of which he knows wherein the illustration of facsimile 1 has been found in a sense and text. He also says that this embalming lion couch scene is significantly different than the lion couch scenes with which he is familiar. This suggests the possibility that 1, it is not a typical embalming scene, and 2, that there may be something highly unusual about this sense and text as compared to other sense and texts. We'll get to more of that later too. There seems to be at least some evidence that the vignette for facsimile 1 was damaged after Joseph had already translated it. Maybe this was in the original that we see in the Pearl of Great Price. One early Latter-day Saint who saw the papyri in 1841, for instance, described them as containing the scene of an altar with a man bound and laid thereon, and a priest with a knife in his hand, standing at the foot with a dove over the person bound on the altar with several idol gods standing around it. Reverend Henry Caswell, who visited Nauvoo in April 1842, had a chance to see some of the Egyptian papyri. Caswell, who was hostile to saints, described facsimile 1 as saying it had a man standing by him with a drawn knife. Some LDS researchers have also argued that the fingers, which critics claim are the wingtips of a second hawk, look more significantly like the fingers, according to Egyptian drawings, than hawk tips. Here we see on the left here again, these are the thumbs, and these are the wings from the drawing. And then if we look at the wings from other Egyptian drawings, we see that generally, oops, back up here. There we go. We see that they're generally, the feathers are together, they're not always spread out. They are down in this one, but they go down rather than up. And this artist here obviously kept these wings tips together rather than separated, which makes it look like they're possibly thumbs. And we also see that how some of these Egyptian artists drew thumbs. Here's a magnification of the thumbs. And then again, we look at the thumb lines in other Egyptian drawings. It's also interesting to note that although embalming priests are typically drawn with Anubis heads, other Egyptian graphics show that Egyptian priests are represented as bald. In fact, shaving one's head was a common practice for those who entered the Egyptian priesthood during the Ptolemaic period, which is when the Joseph Smith papyri was produced. Anubis heads were worn as masks to emulate the gods. Joseph got it right by representing the man with the knife as a priest. So whether he has Anubis head or bald, he's still represented as a priest, which is accurate. Carey Schertz has shown that some of the restorations of facsimile 2 appear to be correct from an Egyptian standpoint, and for the last decade and a half, the late Dr. Hugh Nibley was working on his magnum opus, One Eternal Round, which deals in part directly with facsimile 2, and hopefully someday we'll see that published by Farms, and I'm sure we'll have additional insights to add to our list. Okay, the sense and text in the Book of Abraham. When scholars examined the rediscovered Joseph Smith papyri and compared them to some of the pages of the Kirtland Egyptian papers, an interesting discovery was made. Some of the Kirtland Egyptian papers have Egyptian characters on the left of a vertical line and what appears to be an English translation to the right of that line. And again, Dr. Hodlett will speak more about this tomorrow. What was discovered with the return of the Joseph Smith fragments was that the Egyptian characters to the left of facsimile 1, rather to the left of the line, lined up with the characters to the Egyptian character to the left. There's facsimile 1, and these characters right here, and that's what's to the left of the line. And this really hadn't been noticed earlier because they noticed then that these two pieces were separate pieces and they joined together. Some have presumed that the so-called Kirtland Egyptian papers demonstrate Joseph's attempt to translate the hieroglyphics. According to most Egyptologists, the translations do not accurately reflect the meaning of the hieroglyphics. In some cases, several paragraphs of English text appear to be an English translation of a single Egyptian character. On the surface, this appears that Joseph put the characters on the left and then translated these characters on the right. As the critics correctly point out, the translations do not match. Egyptologists assure us that there is no relationship between the characters and the text. To the critics, this is proof that Joseph was a false prophet. Most LDS scholars believe that the Kirtland Egyptian papers are an example of backwards translation, so that Joseph already had the translated Book of Abraham and that he and his associates were trying to match the already translated English text to plausible Egyptian characters. Joseph had learned already by now from the Book of Mormon that the ancient texts can be written in compact script like Reformed Egyptian, and he may have thought that a single Egyptian character could yield several sentences of English translation. I'll leave again the arguments to Dr. Hodlett's talk. For the purpose of this presentation, it's important simply to note the apparent relationship. But why did Joseph believe, or possibly believe, that the Egyptian characters on the sense and text translated as the Book of Abraham when Egyptologists tell us they do not? The answer lies in the Book of Abraham itself. In more than one verse, we read that facsimile 1, this representation, is found at the beginning of this record. To the early saints, and most of us today, this would have seemed to indicate that the record of Abraham began with the text following facsimile 1. Dr. Gee believes that Joseph Smith originally had 5 papyrus scrolls. Move one forward, here we go. Of these 5 scrolls, only 11 fragments of 2 scrolls have survived. And part of the reason why he believes there was 5 different scrolls is that you had 1 scroll per person, and here's the names of them, and that includes the hypocephalus down here. So there's 5 different scrolls, and the colored portions are what we have left. So there's a lot missing. He says of the 5 scrolls, only 11 fragments of 2 scrolls have survived. Hugh Nibley claimed that according to tradition, one of the scrolls was so long that when it was unrolled, it extended through 2 rooms of the mansion house. Not all of the sense and texts are of equal length, and Dr. Gee estimates that the Joseph Smith sense and text may have been longer than some or most of other comparable sense and texts. And keep in mind that the presence of facsimile 1 in the Joseph Smith sense and text suggests that this sense and text may have been very different than other similar sense and texts. Dr. Gee suggests that Joseph may have had 8 times as much papyri as what is currently extant. A number of scholars contend that the reason that the extant papyrus fragments don't have anything to do with the Book of Abraham is because we no longer have the portion of papyrus which would have contained the Book of Abraham text. In rebuttal, the critics claim that since the scroll of Horus is a fairly typical sense and scroll, we would have the entire scroll, that the entire scroll would not be much longer than those portions that we have. And so they say basically there couldn't have been anything else. And furthermore, they contend we know that this particular scroll is the source because Abraham claimed that facsimile 1 was at the commencement of this record. Now, there's problems with this claim. To quote Dr. Gee, some people assume that if the documents, the Joseph Smith papyri, are funerary, they cannot contain anything else. Some Book of the Dead papyri, however, do contain other texts. He notes, in fact, let's see, here we go. He notes, in fact, that about 40% of sense and text have other documents attached to them. Almost 40%. That's a lot of other texts that have something attached to them. So when Abraham said that facsimile 1 began at the commencement of this record, he, or more likely the scribe who composed the roll, as we'll discuss momentarily, was referring to the commencement of this scroll.